Good afternoon. Good afternoon. We are welcoming all our guests, and I'm very excited to open this lecture and meeting that will inaugurate the establishment of the Media Chinese Center in our college. I would like first to thank some people, and then we move to the lecture and the interviewer. First, I want to thank Alex Pevzner, which is going to be the manager of the center, and thanks to his endeavor, we are here, and we hope to be here in the future of this, the success of this center. I would like to thank also Barry and Anne Swirsky that were behind the initiation, and Yuda Weinrop that was the matchmaker, I would say, and thanks to him also we are here. We're working with this more than a year, just to let you know. I just checked my calendar. I would like to thank Professor Zev Newman, our president, the president of the college, that agreed to have us start this idea and to continue with the endeavor to establish this center. And Neil Levy, the vice president of external relations and development of the college, that worked with us and especially with Alex, and still have a lot to do. And I would like to thank Marty Karp, that is with us from the beginning, and through him and John Fischel and Guilford and Diane Glazer Foundation, we have the first endowment and the privilege to have Professor, our guest of honor here, Professor Shirk. We also would like to thank, in absence, Jennifer Laszlo Mizrahi, that without her endeavor behind the scene, we also would have not been here. We would also like to thank Ambassador Matan Vilnai that joined us for this endeavor, and also, I don't know if you remember, you gave a letter to Alex to start.
It was a very good letter.
A very good letter.
I'm old, but I remember.
No, I thought you have so many business around in China, so a very, very helpful letter, and thanks. And former ambassador to China, Amos Nadai, that also is with us. And of course, our guest lecturer, Professor Susan Shirk, that in no time agreed to give up her only free day to be with us here. And we could not think of a more appropriate and final lecture at this opening session of our center. And now I move the chair to Alex Pevzner that will do the interview. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Professor Nosek, for welcoming us to the School of Media Studies, and Professor Neumann for welcoming the idea of the Chinese Media Center into the College of Management. I'd like to briefly introduce you to Professor Shirk. Professor Shirk is, she doesn't look that way, but she's kind of a rock star when it comes to China studies in the US. Susan Shirk is the chair of the 21st Century China Program and Hong Wei-Lung, Professor of China and Pacific Relations at the School of International Relations and Pacific Studies, San Diego. Professor Shirk was also in the US government from 1997 to 2000. Professor Shirk served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs, with responsibility for China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Mongolia, which is a big chunk of East Asia. Professor Shirk's publications basically define the area of how do we understand the Chinese government. She wrote How China Opens Its Door, the political success of the PRC's foreign trade and investment reforms, the political logic of economic reform in China, and China Fragile Superpower. Her latest book is this book, Changing Media, Changing China. As you can see, is read it several times, very useful. And I know some other people here in the room who have also benefited from your book, some people from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So, thank you very much for taking the time. We stole you from another event. Maybe a word about why the Chinese media matters. First of all, a quarter of the world's newspapers are in Chinese. Okay, a quarter. About 130 million copies are being printed every day in China. It's a result of some very interesting and deep reforms that the Chinese government has implemented in the industry. Of course, the largest internet market, 680 million users. An entirely independent and endogenous social media ecosystem. What's interesting about the Chinese media is that it's still state-owned. There is no private media in China in the Western sense, but the media has to behave and has to earn its money. They have to behave as a free market media because they are competing basically in a capitalist market, chasing readers and subscribers. So maybe start with kind of a general question. A new leadership, there's a new generation of leadership in China. Xi Jinping took over the position of Secretary General of the Communist Party in 2012. That's what's called the fifth generation of leaders. Has there been any recent changes in Chinese politics specifically that are impacting the area of Chinese media?
Xi Jinping is trying to rule like a strong leader. I think there's widespread criticism in China of the previous 10 years because the then President Hu Jintao and the Prime Minister Xi Jinping and the rest of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, the Chinese leadership, appeared to be indecisive. And there was a lot of different agencies going their own way. So it appears that Xi Jinping and others have diagnosed this problem and are trying to establish stronger central authority. The media policy associated with this is not yet clear, frankly. I don't think there's any sign that Xi Jinping loves the media any more than any other political leader in any country loves the media. By and large, they are suspicious of the media and think they'll only make trouble for them. So, so far, I don't see any differences in Xi Jinping, except that he is paying special attention to online social media as a source of information about feedback from public opinion, but also a potential threat in terms of a potential opposition movement to Chinese Communist Party that he is paying close attention to. So maybe that's a start, and we'll talk about all those things more, I'm sure.
Right. This is very interesting what you're saying about the feedback, a way for the Chinese leaders to gauge what the public is thinking. some people sometimes see China as a monolith, but China not only it isn't monolithic, it has also very robust public opinion, and the Chinese leaders are quite attuned to the views of the public. In your book, you quote a foreign policy official that says he's reading Global Times on the internet to understand what the public is thinking. Perhaps you can elaborate on how this exchange of views plays out in the media?
Well, of course, China's leaders, China's a non-democratic country, it's an authoritarian country, but you might say paradoxically, it's hypersensitive to public opinion. And probably more sensitive than leaders in other countries, because in China there's tremendous uncertainty on the part of the leadership about how the public actually feels about them, because they don't have elections to give them that information periodically. And they are quite nervous about the possibility of a opposition movement, especially after 1989, Tiananmen crisis, when you had demonstrations in more than 130 cities that persisted for some time. The leadership split over how to handle the protests, and only because the military followed orders, stepped in and used force, did the regime survive. And of course, that same year, the Berlin Wall falls, and communist governments in Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, Central Asia also start to fall. So for that reason, the Chinese leadership is very, very nervous about how long they can survive in power. To us outside of China, it looks so successful. The growth rates are so miraculous, and people assume that this is a very strong, confident government, but the fact is, no, they are really extremely nervous. So what this means is that they are watching very carefully to see what public views are, because they want to satisfy the public sufficiently to take any air out of an opposition movement. So I think the media is a very useful way for them to try to gauge public opinion. It also is more vivid and direct, especially online media, where very decentralized. People are posting their own microblogs or their own statements in chat rooms and things like that. So sometimes leaders themselves go online to read these postings, or they have special offices or secretaries who do it for them, and they track this very, very closely. Want to make sure that the public, by and large, maintains its support for party rule.
Yes, it's very interesting what you're saying. My next question is actually about the internet. Indeed, the media is a useful way to gauge public opinion, but in recent years, and it probably started even before the new generation of leadership that entered power, there has been a sort of a clampdown, or at least a tightening of rules in media in general and in the internet in particular. So first they tightened the rules of registration on Weibo, so that people had to use their real name to register for an account. Then there was the crackdown on the big Vs, people with the large following, that they were called to the authorities for talk and say, you have to be a little bit more patriotic. In January 2013, there was the Southern Weekly editorial incident, where an entire editorial by Southern Weekly was replaced. The editorial was about constitutionalism, and that was deemed sensitive, so the entire editorial was replaced. So is it a sign of weakness on the part of the authorities, or because in a way, if they clamp too hard, then they won't be able to understand what the people really think?
This is really a very complex story, so I'm going to try to be brief, but the propaganda department of the Chinese Communist Party is one of the most powerful organizations within the party. And of course, their whole raison d'etre is, and the way they get more budgets, bigger budgets, more influence, is to argue that there's a big threat out there that they have to combat. And they have to combat it by sort of positive propaganda about the party, and they have to combat it by sending directions to various kinds of monitors and to editors of publications to get them to remove anything that might lead to subversion of party rule. So, you know, I'm pretty well known in China for sort of being very critical of the propaganda system, the propaganda authorities. I think, frankly, Chinese Communist Party can rule China very successfully without a propaganda department. And if I were China's leaders, I would close the propaganda department, because I think they were, for one thing, the censorship, especially online censorship, is so evident. People can see what are the sort of anodyne, innocent, trivial things that get taken off. You know, they see them there for a short period of time, and then they come off. And what does this signify to people? This signifies that the party is so scared that it feels it can't allow people to read this kind of news. And I think that's, you know, basically weakens popular support for the party. The other thing, of course, is that by requiring and by paying for, in many cases, pro-government opinion to be posted, yes, it totally destroys the value of the media as an accurate gauge of public opinion. Because I think what happens is they know that a lot of the pro-government stuff is ginned up. It's not real. It's not genuine. So therefore, probably a lot of the pro-government statements are simply discounted. And all they pay attention to is the critical ones. Whereas, in fact, if you had a real open marketplace of ideas, they would have a more accurate view. But even so, let's imagine for now that there was no censorship and that it was wide open. There's still, you know, online opinion is not truly representative of public opinion, because you always get more extreme views being posted online. Lots of people who are cautious or middle of the road, they'll go online just to read. They're not going to post anything. So it's somewhat skewed in the direction of more extreme views. But of course, if what you're worried about is collective action, protest, it's probably those people with the skewed views who are going to be out there on the street, you know, making trouble. So in that way, maybe it's okay to just look at internet opinion. But just to finish up this comment, I feel that the paranoia of the party in its management of the media, it definitely reduces the value to it of the media as a feedback for public opinion.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. Now let's talk on the other side. So one way for the party to gauge public opinion is to follow the media. But the party is not a passive player, it's also an active player, okay? So even in traditional China, every emperor would come with a slogan, like an era name, Nian Hao, to encapsulate his policy and legacy. In Mao's China, there was a song, 没有共产党就没有新中国. There was no communist party, there wouldn't be a new China. And even after Mao, there's perhaps a more moderate tradition in the sense that I think starting from Jiang Zemin, every leader tries to leave a legacy. So Hu Jintao talked about a harmonious society. Xi Jinping came with a slogan that is, to my mind, is pretty American, actually, Chinese dream. Do you think the Communist Party is maybe perhaps getting better in communicating its ideas and ideals to the public, or is it more of the same?
I was just thinking, I wonder if Stan Greenberg has been to Beijing. That's a very famous political consultant. Yes, he's been to Israel, right? So,
We worked with the Israel project.
yeah. Well, I agree that China Dream is a nice, optimistic vision that's not very well defined, and therefore it can be whatever you hope it is, which is a nice slogan. So it, sure, I think it's fine, and it sounds almost like something you would find in any country, right? The politician, and I think Xi Jinping is a savvy politician in terms of trying to appeal to the public. He has been, going to the dumpling shop and, doing these media events, that get covered. But let's remember, this is a tradition in China. Mao used to go down to mix with the people, too, to show that his, and there are all these posters all over, Mao posters of him, rolling up his sleeve, doing manual labor with the peasants and things like that. So it's very much in that tradition. Well, that's a more heroic gesture.
Okay. Next question is a little bit harder. I would like to talk a little bit about the interplay between policy formulation and the media. So we know the Chinese government is monitoring public opinion. We know they're almost hysterical about it. And we know that public opinion counts, perhaps counterintuitively. Can we trace, we cannot open the black box of specifically foreign policy formulation in China, but can we gauge something based on the output? Can we gauge any relation to public opinion? I guess you wrote a lot about this in your book, specifically China, specifically Japan and Tibet and issues like this, but can it be said that in any area of Chinese foreign policy, there's an input for public opinion?
Oh, absolutely. Just as we find in other countries around the world, especially authoritarian countries, things like price increases for gas, or electricity prices, all sorts of things that really should be done to reduce the burden on the government and make the system operate more efficiently. They get very nervous about doing this because of public opinion. So, and there's lots of good evidence of that, I think, that they don't want to do something that would really arouse people and send them into the street. And they're certainly very worried about inflation. I think they're more worried about inflation than unemployment in China, because inflation was the context for 1989 Tiananmen. As to foreign policy, again, this is a very complicated story. you know, when Mao died and the Mao era was over, and people had really gotten pretty alienated, politically alienated by the Cultural Revolution, Deng Xiaoping, the next great leader of China, he tried to restore support for the party by means of economic reforms and by improving living standards, because Chinese per capita income had remained more or less stagnant since the 1950s. So, you know, that's the start in the 1979, the start of this dramatic takeoff in the Chinese economy. And at the time, Deng Xiaoping actually tried, and Mao himself were pretty open to good relations with Japan. They, Deng especially, tried to bring advisors from Japan in to help advise the market economy. And I remember myself in 1980, one of my first field research visits to China, sitting in Chongqing in the place I stayed was like a cadre official conference center. And there was a documentary on Japan. And the main story was Japan modernized very dramatically, and yet the traditional values of Japan remained alive, of taking care of the family, respect for elders. People were completely positive about Japan. So, and this is despite, of course, the history of Japan's wartime aggression in China. It was not that intensely felt. But by the time you get to Jiang Zemin era, after starting in the early 1990s, Jiang Zemin, he doesn't have a personal following like Deng Xiaoping did or Mao did. So he's searching around for how can we build up popular support for the party. You know, yes, the economy is improving, but practically nobody believes in communism anymore. So what are we going to do? He turns to nationalism, and he starts something called a patriotic education campaign. The schools, the movies, everything is just saturated with anti-Japanese propaganda of wartime history. I mean, even today, in the movie theaters, especially during certain times of year, these anti-Japanese war movies are just saturation. You can hardly find anything else. And so I don't want to claim that anti-Japanese sentiment in China is completely constructed by party government efforts, because you can find lots of anti-Japanese Chinese outside of the PRC. And there are lots of anti-Japanese protests in Hong Kong, Taiwan, New York, San Francisco. So it's a lot of the sentiment is just the spontaneous result of identifying with the rising China that's coming back from a period of humiliating weakness. And it's just natural and spontaneous. But the party itself has definitely stoked this in order to get people to support the party. And so this anti-Japanese sentiment in China now is very much a factor in Chinese policy toward Japan. And we can talk about specific instances of this, including anti-Japanese protests in China, but it would be a mistake to see it as completely spontaneous. These protests are also either they give a red light, a yellow light, or a green light. And sometimes there's a red light, no protests, but otherwise they...
The Japanese embassy in Beijing is I saw the protest. Well organized, like I used to do, with buses, with slogans.
Trade unions.
With you are now, you are in after the, I saw it. Very spontaneous.
Choreographed.
Very organized proceedings. Organized. You're absolutely right.
It's very interesting what you're saying. In Taiwan may be slightly different from China in the sense that many people in Taiwan, because they're afraid of China, they'd rather associate themselves with the previous conqueror, that is Japan, and a lot of people are even studying Japanese. It's very common also among the younger generation. But it's very interesting what you're saying. You're right that in a way it's a devil that was created by the Communist Party, but now they have to, ride this dragon, and they may not control it in the sense that feel constrained by nationalistic public opinion.
I just want to say one other thing about that. Of course, the media loves to run exciting stories against Japan, also against the United States often, or about Taiwan, because, as you point out, now we have a commercial media. So they are competing for audiences. And as everybody who studies media knows, no news, good news is no news. It's conflict, it's military issues that really attract audiences. So they love to exaggerate and dramatize, pictures of military exercises in Japan, U.S.-Japanese joint exercises, these kinds of things are get audiences. So I think the commercial media definitely contributes to the anti-Japanese sentiment as well.
Yeah. So, in a sense, foreign policymakers, they may feel constrained by nationalistic public opinion, although I think in the case of the U.S. it's more toned down. I think the government can and does try to sort of limit the amount of criticism towards America in the media. It's less virulent in the case of Japan. Have we seen cases that the Chinese government, like Western governments, citing public opinion as a way to strengthen its hand, its negotiations? Like, we have Congress, we have the parliament, we have the angry Chinese youth.
No, of course, I can't, count the number of times in negotiations with China in which I heard about the hurt feelings of the 1.3 billion Chinese people. Because authoritarian governments are at a big disadvantage in negotiations because they don't have the club by the door, of a democratically elected legislature or the voters who they can credibly claim constrain them. So it looks like they have complete autonomy. So how do they create what the international relations scholars call audience costs? My former student, Jessica Weiss, who now teaches at Yale, she's done very interesting analysis of anti-foreign protests in China as a way of generating audience costs. What's the key, you see, is leaving something to chance. In other words, only the demonstrations that could turn against the government and accusing the government of being too weak really are effective. Something that is completely stage managed has no impact in terms of increasing the bargaining leverage. It's only when other countries, other governments see that the Chinese government faces a infuriated public that becomes violent, so violent against an issue that they might actually turn against the Chinese leaders and government itself, which of course has happened in the past. you know, let's remember that the Qing dynasty and the Republic of China both were brought down by opposition revolutionary movements in which specific domestic discontents were fused together by this powerful emotion of anti-foreign nationalism, and they accused the government of being too soft in the face of foreign aggression. So when the Chinese government decides to allow protests or even, you know, give the green light, but they're not stage managed and they can potentially turn against the government itself, that definitely creates bargaining leverage. But more recently, with anti-Japanese protests that look very stage managed, they don't really generate that much leverage in terms of negotiations with Japan.
Thank you. It seems like a very risky policy.
Well, it's what they call it in international relations theory, the threat that leaves something to chance. It's the unpredictability of what happens to those protests that really generates the bargaining leverage.
I suppose they still feel confident in a way that they can control it if worst comes to worst.
Well, what I find totally fascinating is they have never allowed a demonstration on the Taiwan issue. And I speculate that it's because they, you know, and now, of course, there's no need for protests on Taiwan because everything's going smoothly. But during periods when Taiwan politicians were moving toward independence, the public learns about these things through the media, they get upset, but they never allowed a demonstration because of fear that it could really get out of hand.
Right. I have another question relating to policy media connection. There was a slogan in China, seek truth from facts, okay, adopted by Mao Zedong, then by Deng, to refer to what is called socialism with Chinese characteristics. Now, my late teacher, Professor Eliofe, used to say that studying Chinese politics is seeking truth from unknown facts, because the Chinese policy making is a black box in many ways. But sometimes we can get a glimpse of into the power struggles and the internal debates by watching the media. The famous Chinese journalist Liu Binyan wrote about this, that Deng sometimes used the People's Daily to promote a certain agenda. I'm wondering if we can see a similar phenomenon in today's media and internet, or is there a sign, or is the Chinese leadership is actually more unified and there's no need to use such tactics?
Well, of course, in the old days when you couldn't even go to China, when I started studying China back in the 1960s, all we had to go on was reading Chinese official media and trying to see signs of different two-line struggle, or, you know, what was different points of view. And nowadays, of course, we can go to China and do research, but also the media is by no means quite so unified. They have different audiences that they're appealing to, and they have a little more latitude to appeal to those audiences. Now, to what extent do different positions that you see in the media reflect differences within the government? That is very, very difficult to ascertain. On the other hand, there is some of the business and economics publications, Caixin, Caijing, they do report on differences of opinion among different agencies in the government on economic issues. You know, they're pretty open at reporting the bureaucratic politics that help us understand the policy process. But you never see anything like that about foreign policy or elite politics. You know, so for example, right now there's a big roundup of all of the associates of a man named Zhou Yongkang. Zhou Yongkang is the former security czar, internal police, secret police czar of China in the last administration. Very, very powerful guy. He came up through petroleum corporations and petroleum business. So this is supposedly an anti-corruption effort. He is under like party house arrest right now, or not necessarily house arrest. He's being held by party. He hasn't been indicted legally yet. And people are waiting to see. They're predicting that he will actually probably be indicted. But this is like a really big target. And anti-corruption campaigns in China are not about corruption primarily. They're kind of the weapon of elite politics. It used to be in the Mao era that ideological campaigns, accusing someone of being a capitalist roader or bourgeois expert, that was just a way they competed with one another. Now they go after them for corruption-related issues.
Just shows how the focus of China Incorporated moved from ideology to business in general.
Yeah. So, and of course, because of corruption is so pervasive, that even if individuals are not that corrupt, the family, almost all families, someone in the family is doing things that they shouldn't be doing. So, so can you learn about the fight over with Zhou Yongkang by reading Chinese media? Absolutely no. It's taboo. All elite politics taboo. So you read about it in Hong Kong or Taiwan, or there are leaks. Interesting, the foreign journalists get leaks about elite politics. I once asked a Chinese journalist friend of mine what he thought about elite politics, about Jiang Zemin versus Hu Jintao or something like that. And he says, I don't pay any attention to this because I know I can't write anything about it. So it's the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg that get all the stories about elite politics. But you notice now the Chinese government is basically trying to get rid of those people from China, because they started publishing all these amazing exposés about former Prime Minister Wen Jiabao, even about Xi Jinping's family himself, Bloomberg.
Chris Buckley's still in Hong Kong. So
they are basically just coming down very, very hard on those publications, because the taboo topic of leadership politics, they want to keep it all secret, because if it becomes known that there is serious conflict at the top, it creates what is sometimes called a political opportunity structure, that you may then start getting more bottom-up pressure. And you know, most Leninist systems like China, they fall top-down, not bottom-up. So I believe that if and when regime change happens in China, it will come as a result of fights within the elite. So that's why they got to keep it secret. It's the most taboo area.
Yes, change will come from the top, but they're still worried about various dispossessed groups uniting together to fight the Communist Party. I'd like to move a little bit to the subject of reforms in the past 3 decades.
Can I ask a question? Are we going to have time for questions?
Yes.
Okay,
in the past 3 decades, there was a series of reforms in the Chinese media. Basically, the Chinese media looks and partly behaves like Western media, but of course, the boss behind it is different. It's not entirely the market. There's a relatively new trend of central government outlets filing for IPO, which is pretty amazing if you think about the People's Daily selling shares to the public. Maybe it's because it's People's Daily. So the People Daily went public in 2013. Xinhua's website filed for an IPO. People say, well, it's more money for the propaganda machine. But do you think maybe one day it will lead to erosion of government control because these outlets will not be entirely beholden to the government?
Well, certainly the more their financing comes from outside the government, the more potential independence they have. And all of these publications, Xinhua, official media, Xinhua, People's Daily, CCTV, they're all trying to get advertising and appeal to audiences too. But the problem they have is how do they establish credibility? They're, especially CCTV, is a complete laughingstock in China. I mean, the most symbolic moment was when I happened to be in China at that time, when there was a huge fire at the CCTV building, next to the building, where they were having a fireworks display for Mid-Autumn Festival. The new building. But right next to, not the big, not the, right, but right next to it, but it's part of the complex. And that, they had, what, you started?
They said he's been there. Who started the firecracker?
Oh, you were there during the fire too, yeah. So the fire was started by an executive at CCTV who was pyrotechnic, I mean, not a maniac, no, but he loves fireworks. Loves fireworks. So I don't know where he got the money for it, to have a big fireworks display during Mid-Autumn Festival. And the story is that the public security people, sort of warned him and everything, and he just, I don't know, paid them off or something in order to have this fireworks. And the fireworks created, so they did it to themselves. They set the fire. And what was, every night in China there is the nightly news, CCTV nightly news, which is a tradition that has to be, most local TV cable stations have to show it, and it is like the official news report. So if you want to know what the government thinks is important, you just watch the nightly news. And a lot of government officials or people who need to work with the government, they have to watch it so they know what the government thinks. But what was really hysterical is that in their nightly news report, they led with the story of these fires in Australia. And only I think at the end, some 2 lines about there being a fire in this building. So they buried the story. Meanwhile, people are standing on the sidewalk, taking videos of the fire, posting them online, and it goes all over the country. So the contrast between the real news, which is going out spontaneously online, and what CCTV wants to tell people was very, very vivid. So this is a big problem for official media, and a related problem is just the credibility of the government itself. Because if the government's official media is not trusted, nor is the government trusted. And and that leads people to go search for more reliable information, mostly from the internet.
Thank you very much. Two last questions, and then we'll move to Q&A. I would like to try to contradict you in what you said in the beginning, that Xi Jinping is not a big fan of media. I'd like to talk about China's soft power. So China spent billions on building global media outlets like CCTV, Xinhua. Even Xinhua now is an English TV channel for Xinhua. China is building Confucius institutes around the world. Now, you raised the issue of credibility of the government, the general credibility. We noticed that Xi Jinping, unlike previous Chinese leaders, well, maybe not unlike Mao Zedong, but unlike most Chinese leaders, has taken on highlighting his wife. His wife she's an accomplished singer. She's quite an elegant lady, and she's given really high prominence in the media. Do you see a change in the way China thinks about soft power, or is it like Joseph Nye says, the best propaganda is not propaganda?
Well, Kim Jong-un's wife is also being shown. So, no, but I mean, really, I think it's more natural, more normal, and people like it. So I think, that's fine. Yeah, I think that's fine. And soft power, China's, international efforts to build up its prestige and respect, I think it's a big waste of money, frankly, because the credibility problem is huge. And I completely agree with Joe Nye that what matters is, Chinese society and and Chinese business. And all of those things are of great interest to people around the world. And I think people have a lot of curiosity and, in some cases, a lot of respect. In other areas, a lot of suspicion. But government orchestration of it through Confucius Institutes. Confucius Institutes are good to help people learn Chinese. Beyond that, I don't think they have a lot of respectability as sources of independent research and knowledge. And the same thing for CCTV, English, I feel sorry for these people because they're trying to act like real journalists. But, the fact of the matter is they're still very much constrained by official line.
Well, I totally agree with you that the Chinese culture has enough appeal on its own to attract foreigners. It's good that you raised the issue of Chinese journalists. This is my last question. I want to talk about the future of the industry. I mean, beyond any issues of ideology, when you come into contact with Chinese journalists, you discover that their professional standards are not particularly high. So on the one hand, you have protests like after the removal of the editorial by the Southern Weekly. I mean, you have masses of people, journalists, and not just journalists, coming on the street to protest, which is very impressive. I was just talking to some friends of mine in Beijing, both of them Xinhua reporters, and they complained that they have to take Marxism courses all over again, the same Marxism courses that they did when they were students. How do you see the profession and the industry evolving within the current framework of what we have in China?
Well, it's true. Under Xi Jinping, all journalists have to take a refresher course to make sure they're politically correct, and then take a little test to get a license again, which is just a lot of mafan and a waste of time for people resent it, but it's not too onerous. So Chinese journalists are some of the greatest people I know who really want to be real professional journalists. Of course, in China, in the Mao era, there was no real journalism as we know it. It was all propaganda. So journalists were just government employees who worked for newspapers. There's no sense of what a professional journalist is. The mission of a journalist to report accurately about what is happening in the world, what is happening in China, to improve the information that the public and the government has. There's nothing to tell the truth. That professional ethic just didn't exist at all. And then with the emergence of a market-oriented media and many journalism schools throughout China, that kind of professional role identification has increased. But it's still at a very early stage, and it's buffeted by these two cross pressures. One is most journalists are not paid very well, and they therefore are vulnerable to becoming corrupted themselves. A lot of business and government organizations give out little red envelopes to get people to come cover their press conferences and things like this. And they even have a whole industry of public relations. You all studying public relations in China, you have to be very, very careful about this, because a lot of public relations is corrupt activity to get journalists to either say something positive or, probably more frequently, bury bad news. So and then journalists can go to the business people and basically extort money. They can say, "Oh, I've discovered this thing about your company. You got to pay me to suppress the story." It's the Wild West out there. I mean, it is very, very corrupted. And then the other kinds of pressure is, of course, the government censorship and control. So then to carve out some scope for telling the truth and being a true journalist is really extremely difficult. And so that's why I think exchanges and contacts with schools like yours can be very, very important to try to reinforce this, the ethics and the definition of what it means to be a true journalist.
Thank you very much. To be a journalist in China is not for the weak at heart, that's for sure. We'll take a few questions.
Please, Neil there.
Professor Shirk, would you care to comment about how Israel is reflected in the media? Has that changed? Has that been manipulated? Are we under radar screen at all?
I have to say it's not something I follow and really have any knowledge about, so I can't. I'm sure my colleague here will have a lot more information than I do about that. Right? You want to say something?
Yes, this is something that I try to track. Israel, in a sense, Israel is a beneficiary of a decision that was probably taken high up in the Chinese government to try to develop relations with Israel. And so Israel in general doesn't get a lot of bad media per se. In other words, there's no angry articles like the Chinese write about Japan or disparaging the US or things like this. And also, for some reason, all the Chinese think that Jews are smart, and here in Israel we're probably Jews. So
therefore, it's important to understand that the rank and file, the people in the streets, they admire Israel. The government is interest, and this is
right.
This is the difference.
Right. There's the public opinion, and there's the leadership.
We're in a wonderful situation.
Yeah.
In a wonderful situation.
Right. On the other hand, if you read sort of more general reports about the Middle East in general, Israel doesn't necessarily come out so well. So there's a dichotomy there. There's like the Jews are good, but there's some sort of a problem here in the Middle East.
My name is Guy. I got a two-part question. First of all, is there any act or movement of freedom of information that's starting in China? That's the first question. I assume there isn't from what I heard. The second one, I would like to hear, how is it to be a journalist in China? We talked about the Chinese journalists from a Western view, like we circumcise them. And I would like to know, how is it possible that there are so many journalism or media? We said it's a quarter of the half world news. How is it to be like a journalist? What are the Chinese journalist values? Because we know that the values of a Western journalist is to seek the truth or to serve the politic. So I want to know, what if I was a journalist in China? What would I value?
The question is, I guess, what do you study as a journalist?
Right. But the question of the movement for freedom of the press or free information in China is actually very, very strong. Yes, because lots of people who are not particularly political are really outraged that the government treats them like children and blocks them from certain types of information. I mean, we have no way of knowing how strong this feeling is, but anecdotally, it appears to be very, very strong. And so that's why I say this propaganda department censorship. You know, it's not so evident with print or television because you read a newspaper, you don't know what's been taken out. Mm-hmm. But with the internet, something goes up and then it comes down. So you can see the hand of the censor is very visible. And people are really frustrated and irritated by it. So, you know, it becomes a focal point for opposition to the government and to the party. Now, having said that, I want to point out, because I may have given the wrong impression, that lots of things are wide open on the media, not censored at all. Things related to sports or culture or technology. Those things are just wide open. And even some problems in China are discussed quite openly without censorship, like environmental problems, food and medicine quality. The government has allowed very free reporting of those issues because they also need help finding out what the problems are so they can try to solve them. So this kind of watchdog media has been permitted in some areas. But then in lots of other areas related to something that the government feels would be subversive, create opposition, they take them down after you see them, including some international things. On the question of the values of journalists, I think I just addressed that really by saying that, you know, I think young journalists are very idealistic. They really want to serve society, but then they confront all these difficulties.
There was a senior anchor in CCTV who
ותודה רבה לכם.
למי שלא מכיר, זה היה שגריר ישראל בסין, מתן וילנאי. There was a senior anchor in CCTV who...
אתם צריכים להבין, זה מדינה קומוניסטית, הכל בא מלמעלה, אין מושג בחירות, אין מושג של של מחשבה עצמאית, אין דברים כאלה, זה הפוך מאיתנו לחלוטין, צריך להבין את זה. אבל זה עובד. אתה לא רואה את זה, אתה לא מבין מה זה. ולכן ההערה של הפרופסור על השחיתות זה פשוט כלי למלחמה פוליטית, ושרוצים, מוציאים את זה החוצה. הערה מצוינת. וצריך, לכן השאלה שלך היא תמימה כל כך, כי אתה שואל נכון, אתה פשוט שואל נכון. אנחנו זה מובן לנו מאליו, שם זה אחרת לגמרי. אתה מדבר שם עם סטודנטים, זה שונה לחלוטין, ממש שונה לחלוטין, כי הכל בא מלמעלה, שום דבר לא מלמעלה, אבל זה סיפור אחר. תודה רבה לך.
Just עוד שנייה, there was a senior CCTV anchor who published a letter. He resigned after several years in CCTV because he said he couldn't do his job. He came with certain ideas and values out of school, and he felt that he was betraying his profession. His resignation letter was posted on Weibo, the Chinese Twitter, and was taken down promptly by the censors, but it was retweeted and came up in other websites. Yes, Amos.
Susan, thank you very much for your interesting remarks. I don't have a question. I want to remark about propaganda and censorship, and I'd like to say that I believe that the Chinese leadership is smart enough to understand that it is counterproductive, inefficient, and so on. But there are two things. One, it's very deep into the DNA, and there's this sense of insecurity that you were talking about. But if you take, and I didn't make it methodically, but if you take propaganda and censorship 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and you look at it today, it's totally different. I participated not very long ago in a conference of sinologists arranged by the Ministry of Information. It was very, very sophisticated. I mean, we were exchanging views, people from all over the world, knowing well the defaults of the system, and we found it very, very different from what we believe, or my colleagues knew, used to be like 5 or 10 years ago.
זה שגריר עמוס נדאי, השגריר הקודמו של מתן וילנאי בתפקיד.
Some people have talked about this as Control 2.0. It is extremely sophisticated. Extremely sophisticated. And, you know, it sounds more genuine. That's why publications like Global Times, the use of the online news sites, all sound very genuine. And yet they are still manipulated. This information is very much manipulated by the party propaganda people. And so it's tricky because now, you know, Western journalists like to read a publication like Global Times or something like that, and then they say, this is the Chinese view. But you can't really say that. A, it's not authoritative. B, the English language Global Times and the Chinese language Global Times are different. They are all under the People's Daily Media Group, so they have some standing, official standing. But they, sometimes people say it's the undertones of Chinese foreign policy. So really, you compare it with what the spokesperson of the Chinese Foreign Ministry is saying, which is the truly authoritative statement of the government. So it's an effort to, you know, to signal, but the signals are not coming through. It's hard to interpret signals because you don't really know what they mean and how authoritative they are.
It seems that in the West, especially among conservative economists, there is the determinist kind of view that capitalism or liberal economy will lead to liberal and open media and will lead to democracy. Looking at what happened in Russia, it led the other way around. The question is that could you see signs of democratization because of the new liberal economy and kind of window to some other media?
The situation in China is really somewhat dispiriting from the standpoint of people hoping that the Chinese people will have the opportunity to live under a democratic system in the future. Because following the introduction of market reforms in the late 70s, there was a lot of opening up of the political system too in the 1980s, especially. Tiananmen, 89, led to a big backlash and more cautious but still important experiments of ways to get public feedback into government, and they introduced village elections at the very lowest level. But in the past decade or so, it's like a U-turn going back to greater party control and government control. So, the future is very uncertain. In my class, so I teach a big Chinese politics class, and I just finished up the quarter last week. I have this year 80 students, which is crazy. And many of them are from China, maybe a quarter are from China. But what was interesting is that I had a discussion on the last day about, okay, you really have to make a bet, a serious bet, on where China's political system will be 10 years from now. And pretty much everyone predicted it would be basically the same. There were very few people who thought there would be some systemic change of any sort. So it's just interesting that they feel that the system is so resilient that of course it has managed now, it's 65 years that the CCP has ruled China. And more of that period is in the post-Mao than the Mao period. So it's a pretty impressively resilient system, but included in there is a heavy dose of coercion and repression.
Right, please.
In the West, we assume that the Western way of life is the best. And I'm not sure that it's an assumption that if China becomes democratic, it's going to be better for the Chinese people. I'm not sure that Korea democratic is better for the Korean people, and India democratic, well, largest democracy in the world, but it's also better. So I'm just raising a question. I don't think necessarily they're going to be better off. I'm not sure that China is the Chinese people as a people. I don't know if they're miserable or if they're not miserable. And maybe it's much easier, like it's easier to live at home with your parents than it is to go out and be independent. Yeah, they're being looked after. Why should they be better off if they're free?
Well, I have no, I mean, look, this is all, questions of personal values. I just may point out that there's a tremendous flight of capital and talent from China. That people who have the option of moving their wealth are moving it offshore. And they're moving it offshore because they are worried about what the future will hold. And people are also sending their wives, their children to live outside of China. And so, you know, people, of course, that's a small minority of people because most people have no option of leaving and they don't want to leave. But you know, and I think it's a combination of many different factors, and one of the key ones is the environment. Air pollution. It's an absolute, you know, it's health threatening and very uncomfortable to live there. So you don't even have to get into political issues. A lot of people really would like to live where they have cleaner air.
Well, after the Xi Jinping came with the slogan "Chinese Dream," one netizen commented at Weibo, "I have a dream that I'll have clean air and safe food," but it just shows the amount of disrespect and disbelief in the official policy. I would like to.
There was a question in the back, Howard. Student had a question in the back.
I would like to.
I would like to thank Professor Susan Shirk for the exciting insights about China and Alex Pevzner for interviewing. I would like also to thank Dr. Eva Berger that hosted our with her class and my honors seminar that are here. And so now we move to the next stage. Thank you very much.